everyone! Stories that stick with you start right here.
I stopped being surprised a long time ago. That doesn't mean I stopped reacting, just that the reaction moved inward. It settled somewhere behind my ribs, heavy and familiar, like a stone I carry from meeting to meeting. There's always a meeting. Small room. Neutral walls. A table that's meant to feel collaborative but never does. Someone has brought too many people. Someone else has brought none. And in the middle of it all is a child who didn't ask to be the reason everyone is here. This time it's a girl. It's often a girl. She's 16, though she looks younger. Not in a dramatic way, just in that quiet, worn-down way that makes teenagers seem smaller than they are. She sits beside her mother, slightly angled inward, as if trying to take up less space. Her hands are folded so tightly her knuckles are pale. She doesn't look at me. She doesn't look at anyone. She's perfected the art of being physically present while emotionally invisible. Her attendance last year was 60%. I know the number before I open my mouth. I always do. The number sits in my head like a warning sign, flashing red, even as I soften my voice and arrange my face into something that looks like understanding. Can you tell me a bit about what was happening last year? I ask. It's a careful question. An invitation, really. I'm not asking why yet. Why feels accusatory? Why suggests choice? This question leaves room for chaos. I don't get an answer from the girl. Her sister speaks first. She's older, confident, used to being listened to. She leans forward, elbows on the table, as if we're about to have an intimate conversation between adults. I have mental health issues, she says. No hesitation, no apology, and having her stay home with me really helped. Honestly, it saved my life. Saved my life. The room goes still, like it always does when someone uses that phrase. It's a verbal dead end. You don't argue with it. You don't question it. You certainly don't ask for clarification. The phrase hangs there, daring anyone to challenge it without sounding monstrous. I glance at the girl. She flinches, barely. A tightening of her jaw. A breath held for half a second too long. The mother joins in immediately, as if worried the spotlight might shift away from her. And my partner has been in and out of court, she says. He's abusive. Not her father, obviously. But it's been really hard on me. I need her with me for support. Support. She says it like it's a medical necessity. Like the girl is a prescription. There were court dates, the mother continues. Several. I couldn't be alone. She couldn't just go to school knowing I was there dealing with all that. She starts listing them. Dates. Charges. Outcomes. I don't need the details, but she gives them anyway, stacking them one on top of another, building a tower of justification, so tall it threatens to collapse. The girl says nothing. She never does. When I finally speak, it's to acknowledge the difficulty. I say things like that sounds incredibly challenging, and I can see how that would be stressful. I say them sincerely, because they are true. But as I speak, a different thought runs underneath, quieter and sharper. None of this was her responsibility. The meeting ends the way these meetings always end, with vague plans, cautious optimism, and an unspoken agreement not to push too hard. The family leaves together. The girl walks a step behind them, eyes on the floor, already preparing herself for whatever comes next. I stay seated for a moment after they go. I always do. I let the room empty out completely before I move, like I'm waiting for something to surface in the silence. It doesn't. This story blends into dozens of others. Another day, another parent, another explanation that sounds absurd when said out loud but is delivered with complete seriousness. My child isn't in because a relative's neighbor had an accident. A parent tells me once. We all needed to be there. I blink. Your child? Yes, she says, offended by the question. We're very close. I don't laugh. I don't sigh. I nod and write it down because I've learned that reacting honestly only makes things worse. People don't want solutions. They want validation. They want their crisis to outrank everything else, including education. What strikes me isn't that families have problems. Everyone has problems. What strikes me is how quickly children are positioned as emotional infrastructure. They're not just affected by adult chaos, they're recruited into it. They're there to hold hands in waiting rooms, to mediate arguments, to sit quietly in court buildings, to absorb breakdowns that have nothing to do with them. They become witnesses, confidants, therapists, anchors. And then we act surprised when school slips down the list. I see it in their behavior. The ones with poor attendance aren't reckless. They're cautious. They apologize too much. They ask permission for everything. They're hyper-aware of adult moods. They don't cause trouble because they're too busy preventing it. They're tired. Sometimes, when I'm feeling particularly bold, I ask the question no one wants to answer. What does she want? There's always a pause. Adults look at each other. Someone laughs nervously. Someone says, "Oh, she doesn't mind." Someone else says, "She understands." Someone says, "Family comes first." No one asks the girl. When I do, she shrugs. "It's fine," she says. Always fine. Always manageable. Always smaller than the adults around her need her to be. I go home after these days feeling like I've failed someone, though I'm never quite sure who. The system, maybe. Or the child. Or myself. I replay conversations in my head. I imagine saying things I didn't say. She's not your support system. She's not responsible for your healing. She's a child, but I know how that would go. I've seen the reaction before. Hurt faces. Accusations. The implication that I don't understand love, loyalty, family. As if love requires sacrifice from the youngest person in the room. I don't think people mean to do this. I don't think they wake up and decide to sabotage their child's future. I think they're drowning, and they grab onto whatever is closest. Unfortunately, what's closest is often their kid. And the kid learns quickly that being needed is more important than being educated. That presence matters more than progress. That saying, "I have to go to school," is selfish when someone else is in pain. That lesson sticks. I see it years later, too, in the way former students talk about their past, in how they minimize their own needs, in how they struggle to prioritize themselves without guilt, in how they still feel responsible for everyone else's emotional weather. These meetings aren't just about attendance. They're about boundaries that were never allowed to form. And I sit there, day after day, watching it happen in real time, wondering how many more children will quietly disappear into other people's crises before anyone calls it what it is. Not devotion, not love, but a slow, invisible theft of childhood. There's a moment in almost every meeting where I can tell the story has been told before. Not just to me, but to doctors, social workers, managers, relatives, anyone who might question why a child isn't where they're supposed to be. The words come out smooth, practiced. The pauses are intentional. The emotional beats land exactly where they're meant to. I've learned to recognize that rhythm. It usually starts with a disclaimer. We're not bad parents. Or you have to understand what we've been dealing with. Then comes the escalation, mental health, legal trouble, trauma, emergencies. By the time the explanation is finished, the original issue feels trivial by comparison. Attendance. School. It almost feels cruel to bring it up again. Almost. What never changes is where the responsibility lands. It lands on the child. I remember another girl, different face, same posture. She sat between her parents, shoulders tight, eyes darting back and forth as they spoke over her. Her attendance wasn't quite as low, but it was dropping fast. "She's very sensitive," her mother said. "She worries about me. She insists on staying home," her father added, nodding solemnly. "We don't force her." The girl stared at the floor. When I asked her directly how she felt about school, she hesitated. Long enough that I could see the calculation happening in her head. What answer would cause the least trouble? What answer would keep everyone calm? "I like it," she said finally. "I just don't want to leave her alone." There it was. Not defiance. Not laziness. Loyalty. I've started to hate that word, even though I know it shouldn't be a bad thing. Loyalty sounds noble. It sounds like strength. But in children, it's often just fear in a nicer outfit. Fear of what will happen if they aren't there. Fear of being blamed. Fear of being needed less. Adults rarely notice how often they frame absence as the child's choice. She didn't want to come in. He insisted on staying home. They get anxious when they're not with me, as if children exist in a vacuum, as if they haven't been taught, subtly and repeatedly, that their presence is crucial to someone else's stability. I once had a parent say, "If she goes to school and something happens to me, she'll never forgive herself." I wanted to ask why that burden belonged to a 14-year-old. But instead I nodded and wrote notes because pushing back too hard never ends well. People don't hear boundaries when they're wrapped in crisis. They hear judgment. The thing that unsettles me most is how normal this has become. How often no one else in the room questions it. How easily phrases like emotional support are used without irony. How rarely anyone asks whether the child has support of their own. And when I do ask, the answers are vague. She talks to her sister. We're very open at home. Family is everything to us. None of those answers address the imbalance. None of them explain why a child is expected to shoulder adult emotions while also being told they're too young to make decisions about their own life. I've seen what happens when this dynamic goes on long enough. The child stops asking for help, stops expressing needs, stops believing their goals matter unless they align with someone else's crisis. Their world shrinks. School becomes stressful not because of the work, but because of the guilt. Every lesson missed feels justified at first. Just one more day, just until things calm down, but things never calm down. There's always another emergency, another argument, another appointment, another breakdown. Education becomes something they're perpetually catching up on, never fully participating in. They're always behind, always apologizing, always trying to prove they care, even as their attendance record quietly tells a different story. And then someone inevitably asks, why aren't they more motivated? I think about the contrast that shows up again and again. Real loss versus emotional chaos. A pet dies. A grandparent passes away. Something undeniably painful, undeniably final. The response is firm but gentle. School might help. Routine is important. You can't stop your life every time something sad happens. But when the pain is adult, unresolved, ongoing, when it's messy and loud and fueled by conflict, suddenly the rules change. Then, the child must be present. Then, school can wait. It sends a very clear message, even if no one means it to. Your grief is manageable. My crisis is not. I sometimes wonder if parents hear themselves, if they realize how often they describe their child as the only thing keeping them together. How often they imply that without this child's constant presence, they might fall apart. It sounds like love. It feels like closeness. To the child, it feels like a trap. I see it in the way they hesitate when I talk about the future. College, training, moving away. Their faces go tight, like I've suggested something dangerous. What about your family? Someone always asks, half joking, half not. The child laughs weakly. Yeah, as if wanting a life of their own is a betrayal waiting to happen. On the worst days, I feel complicit. Like by accepting these explanations, by softening expectations, I'm reinforcing the idea that this is normal. That it's acceptable to trade a child's education for adult emotional stability. But I also know what happens when I push. I've pushed before. I've said, she can't be responsible for your mental health. I've said, support doesn't mean sacrificing school. I've said, this isn't sustainable. The reactions are immediate and defensive. Tears, raised voices, accusations of coldness, of not understanding, of valuing rules over people. The child watches all of it, shrinking further into herself, learning yet another lesson. Speaking up causes harm. So most days, I choose my battles. I document. I encourage. I suggest support services that are rarely taken up. I remind families, gently, repeatedly, that school is not optional, that education matters, that children deserve consistency. And then I watch attendance dip again. I tell myself that being aware is better than being blind. That noticing the pattern matters, even if I can't always stop it. But some nights, that doesn't feel like enough. Some nights, I lie awake thinking about the girls who learned too early that their worth was measured by how well they held other people together. The ones who never got to be just kids. The ones who grew up believing love was something you earned by showing up, over and over, no matter the cost. I wonder how many of them will eventually burn out. How many will feel empty once the crises end, and no one needs them anymore. And I wonder if anyone will connect the dots back to those meetings, to those explanations, to all the times we nodded and said we understood. The longer I do this, the more I realize that attendance isn't the real issue. Attendance is just the visible symptom, the part that can be measured, tracked, highlighted in red. What's happening underneath doesn't fit neatly into spreadsheets or policies. What's happening underneath is quiet erosion, It happens slowly enough that no one panics. A day here, a week there, always for a reason that sounds important in isolation, always framed as temporary, always explained with confidence that things will improve soon. They rarely do. I think about how often children become translators of adult chaos. They explain moods. They smooth over conflicts. They anticipate meltdowns. They learn which words to avoid, which topics to steer away from, which silences to fill. They grow fluent and emotional, whether long, before they finish learning algebra. In meetings, I can see which ones have taken on that role. They monitor the adults in the room more than they listen to me. If a parent's voice tightens, they shift in their chair. If someone sighs sharply, they tense. Their attention is always elsewhere. When I ask them questions, they answer carefully, like they're defusing a bomb. I don't mind, they say. It's okay. I can catch up. They say it with a smile that doesn't quite reach their eyes. There was a girl once, another one, because there are always more, who finally broke that pattern. She came into a meeting already crying. Not dramatic sobbing, just silent tears sliding down her face as her mother spoke for her. She refuses to come to school when I'm unwell, her mother said, exasperated. I don't know what else to do. I waited. Then I asked the girl gently, what happens if you do come in? She looked at her mother, then back at me. She says I don't care about her, she whispered. The room went quiet. Her mother laughed awkwardly. I don't mean it like that. But the damage was already done. The truth had slipped out, unpolished and undeniable. This wasn't about anxiety or sensitivity. This was emotional leverage, whether intentional or not. After the meeting, the girl stayed behind. She hovered near the door, unsure if she was allowed to speak without permission. I like school, she said quickly. I just don't want her to be upset. I think about that sentence more often than I should, because it captures the entire problem in one line. Children are not choosing between school and nothing. They're choosing between school and emotional fallout, between education and guilt, between their own needs and someone else's pain. That's not a fair choice to give a child. What frustrates me most is how often this is framed as closeness, as evidence of a strong bond. She's so caring. He's very mature for his age. They're like my best friend. Those phrases make my stomach tighten. Maturity earned through necessity is not a gift. It's a coping mechanism. It comes at a cost that doesn't show up until much later, when the child grows into an adult who doesn't know how to rest, or say no, or exist without being useful. I've seen former students years later. Some come back to visit. Some message me out of the blue. They tell me about jobs they hate but can't leave, families they still feel responsible for, guilt that flares up every time they prioritize themselves. They don't always connect it to school, but I do. I remember the ones who missed months at a time, the ones who were needed at home, the ones who learned early that love meant sacrifice and boundaries were optional. There's a particular kind of exhaustion that shows up in these kids, not the loud kind, the quiet, resigned kind. They don't fight the system because they're too busy propping it up. Sometimes I try to intervene differently. I talk about independence, about long-term consequences, about how education opens doors, creates options, builds safety. I frame it as care because it is. Sometimes it works. Briefly. More often, I'm met with defensiveness. You don't understand our situation. You're being unfair. Family comes first. I want to ask, at what cost? At what point does support become sacrifice? At what point does love become obligation? At what point does a child stop being a child and start being a safety net? No one ever answers those questions. They just look at me like I've missed something obvious. What's obvious to me is the imbalance. Adults with choices leaning on children without them. Adults with resources asking kids to compensate for what they lack. Adults framing dependence as devotion because it sounds better that way. And the child learns to comply because resisting feels cruel. I sometimes imagine what it would sound like if these stories were told honestly. My child didn't come to school because I can't cope alone. My child missed weeks of education because I needed emotional support. My child is falling behind because my life is unstable. Those sentences are uncomfortable. They don't sound noble. They don't inspire sympathy. So instead, they're wrapped in softer language. Mental health, trauma, family bonds, all real, all important. None of them reasons to hand adult responsibility to a teenager. I carry these stories with me long after the meetings end. They stack up in my mind, blurring together, forming a pattern that's impossible to ignore. It's not that people don't value education. It's that, in moments of crisis, they value relief more. Immediate relief, emotional relief, the comfort of having someone there. Even if that someone is a child who should be worrying about exams, friendships, and growing up, not court dates and adult breakdowns. I don't know what the solution is. I only know what I see. I see children learning too early that their presence is currency, that their absence is dangerous, that their future is negotiable. And I see a system that acknowledges this quietly, documents it carefully, and then moves on to the next meeting. I wish I could say there was a moment where everything clicked. A meeting where someone finally said, "You're right. This isn't fair." A family that stepped back and let their child be just a child. There wasn't. What there was instead was repetition. The same patterns replayed with different faces. The same explanations recycled with new details. The same quiet acceptance that this was just how things were. And me, sitting in the middle of it, trying to hold two truths at once. That people are struggling. And that children shouldn't be collateral damage. Some days I feel like I'm standing on the edge of something that no one else wants to name. Like I'm watching a slow-moving problem that's too uncomfortable to confront directly. It's easier to individualize it, this family, this situation, these circumstances, than to admit there's a broader issue with how we treat children's time, energy, and futures. Because if we admit that, we have to admit something else too. That love doesn't automatically make something right. I've noticed how often the word support is used without defining what it actually means. Support can be listening. It can be helping someone find resources. It can be encouraging independence. But somewhere along the way, support has come to mean presence at all costs. If you're not there, you don't care. If you choose something else, you're selfish. If you prioritize yourself, you're abandoning the family. Those messages sink in early. They shape how these kids see the world and their place in it. They become adults who feel restless when they're not needed, anxious when things are calm, guilty when they succeed independently. They don't know how to exist without being on call. I think about the girl from that first meeting sometimes, the one with 60% attendance. I wonder where she is now, whether she caught up, whether she ever got the chance to step out of the role she was assigned before she was old enough to consent to it. I wonder if she still flinches when someone says they need her. I wish I could say I always handle these situations well, that I always say the right thing. I don't. Sometimes I go quiet. Sometimes I choose the path of least resistance. Sometimes I tell myself that small nudges are better than none at all. But there are days when the weight of it gets to me. Days when I hear another parent explain why school had to take a back seat and I feel something harden inside my chest. Not a lack of empathy, too much of it, maybe. Empathy stretched thin by repetition, by helplessness, by the knowledge that this child's story won't end at this meeting. On those days, I remind myself why I keep asking the questions anyway, why I keep documenting, why I keep saying, gently but consistently, this matters. Because even if no one else in the room says it, the child hears it. They hear that someone noticed, that someone cared enough to ask how they felt, that someone saw the imbalance and didn't pretend it was normal. Sometimes that's all I can offer. A small interruption in a narrative that tells them their worth is tied to how useful they are to others. I don't know if that's enough. I suspect it isn't. But it's something. What I do know is this. Education isn't just about grades or qualifications. It's about giving children a future that isn't entirely dictated by the present chaos of the adults around them. It's about offering them a space where their needs matter, where their absence is noticed not as an inconvenience but as a concern. When that space keeps getting taken away, piece by piece, under the guise of love and loyalty, something important is lost. And it's not just attendance. It's possibility. So when I ask, again and again, why a child hasn't been in school, I'm not being insensitive. I'm not dismissing family bonds. I'm not ignoring pain. I'm trying, in the only way I know how, to draw a line. To say, your child deserves more than this. More than being the glue. More than being the backup plan. More than being the emotional adult in the room. They deserve to learn, to grow, to leave, to come back if they want to, not because they have to. Most people don't hear that part. They hear criticism where there is concern. They hear judgment where there is fear. But I keep saying it anyway. Because every now and then, a child looks at me differently. Like they've just been given permission they didn't know they needed. Like the idea that school matters, that they matter, has landed somewhere deeper than the noise. And that's enough to keep me going, even when I'm tired.
Thank you for being here until the end. I'd love to hear how these stories made you feel, so leave a comment below. And if you'd like more videos like this, make sure to subscribe.